2016 town meeting. At this time, I'll ask folks if you have a cell phone to please turn it to silent mode if you would, or off if you'd be so kind. And now, I'll ask if we would all please stand for the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the
flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Okay, good evening. We have sort of a short but not short direct agenda, so we are kind of fine-tuning what we're intending to do this evening. We've had the pledge. The announcement is related to our next meeting that will occur on November 7th at 7:30 p.m. Tonight we will talk about the workshop, the EOT Lagoon proposal and discussion for consideration, and the discussion and possible consideration of the MOU, the Memorandum of Understanding, related to the square and sidewalk projects on Main Street. After that, we'll be setting the agenda for the November 7th meeting, and should there be a need, we'll sign any approved text amendments or resolutions from this evening. So we really don't have the standard evening of commissioner comments or police reports or staff reports. However, one thing I want to ask for consideration, we do have the audit workshop proposed, okay, or presented as our agenda item. We do have some folks who would like to provide public comment, though, related to the lagoon proposal. And my understanding is...
Mr. Snyder won't be here till about 8:15.
Oh, but we have some folks signed up.
And that is related to the EOT Lagoon proposal. And I'm
Correct.
sure
Yes, it
we
is.
need him available to answer any questions.
Okay, well, I'm going to ask Mr. Lindsay if you would approach just for a moment, if you'd come up to the dais for a moment. I don't want to mischaracterize your statements by any stretch of the imagination,
Understand.
but I want to give you the opportunity to speak because when we go through the audit, it could take about 45 minutes. Is that about accurate or longer? 30 minutes, okay. Which would be, I don't know if that's okay by you to sit through a 30-minute audit
I'd
workshop.
rather not, but I
Okay,
understand.
all right. So to that end, if you want to share your comments related to the lagoon, we'd be happy to hear them, but understand what staff shared with us, that the
Understand.
representatives from the company wouldn't be present.
Thank you.
So
No, I appreciate that.
I just want to give you that consideration.
No, we'll go ahead and make our comments now, if it's all right.
Okay, sure. So let me ask you to do this. If you square up the mic, and if you'd identify yourself and your home address, and then the floor is yours for 5 minutes.
I'm Richard Lindsay at 16737 Creamery Road, Emmitsburg. Not in town limits, but right next to your all's wastewater treatment plant where the proposed lagoon storage area is. I wanted to first thank you for keeping Paul and I apprised of this project. I appreciate the mayor's comments, and Kathy had a nice sit down with us. So we feel like we know what's going on, and we have had a conversation with Mr. Snyder. I guess our only question is, and concern is the fact, if I understand correctly, this could be a 3 to 5 year contract initially. I wasn't quite sure. And one of the things that would concern us is in fact, if things don't go as well as we anticipate, are we locked in on a contract? And have you or would you possibly consider a pilot type contract for maybe a year, just to see for one season, just to see how it goes, and then you or we can evaluate the performance, and then maybe make the decision from there. That was the question and concern that we had.
Great, okay.
All right?
Thank you. I don't know that we're going to be able to address it right now.
Oh, no, I understand
So,
that.
okay,
Just
okay.
kind of wanted to go
Sure.
on the record, if you will, about that. And
Okay.
that was our main concern.
Great, thank you, and thank you both for coming in.
And thank you all again for
sure.
working with us the way you do.
Sure, okay, thank you, sir. Okay, so that's something we'll come back to for consideration when we get to the discussion regarding the lagoon. But now we turn to Ms. Mills with the audit workshop. Or Mr. Taylor, I don't know who's going to kick it off.
Good evening, Commissioners. Good
Yes, sir.
evening, Mayor. We just wanted to have Michelle Mills come up and go through kind of a walkthrough of some of the things she's been doing recently as far as the town audit, and to maybe just educate all of us on the process and what, as far as the results that she's going to present later on for the audit, and kind of walk us through. It's kind of a workshop educational presentation. So I'll pass it on to Michelle.
Thank you. Good evening. We did decide to change it up a little bit. Normally, we're here at the completion of the audit, and with the change in the management team and some relatively new commissioners, we decided maybe it would be better to do a workshop, kind of do a little bit more back to basics and make certain that everybody had a general understanding, and again, just to give you some financial highlights. We did complete the audit last week. The management team received the draft report, and I understand you all were provided a copy of the draft. Normally, you would have only seen it in final form, so this year is going to be just a little bit different. We wanted you to see how it kind of worked on the front end and kind of hear a little bit more about the process instead of just always hearing of the end result. So our first slide talks about our scope of services. We were engaged to perform a financial statement audit and to prepare your uniform financial report. The uniform financial report is due to the state of Maryland. It's a required form. It's a prescribed form that takes a lot of data from the audit report itself. Both the financial statement audit and the uniform financial report are due October 31st. One of the things that we thought would be important to share with you is a little bit about our audit approach. As I mentioned before, you kind of heard about things on the back end, so we thought maybe we'd enlighten you a little bit about things on the front end. When we're performing the audit, we have multiple phases of the audit. The planning and preliminary phases are what we typically do in the June-July timeframe while the town is completing its fiscal year. Typically, we try to do it in June, so if there are any questions or outstanding items, we can address them with management before the fiscal year end closes. During the planning process, we update our understanding of the entity and related risk, and we do a formal risk assessment. We do some fraud inquiries of management. We establish our materiality thresholds, and then we develop an overall audit strategy. Concurrently with the planning, we do what we call preliminary field work, and that is where we review and update any of our documents. So we're looking at grants, leases, loans to make sure we have an understanding of any key aspects of those agreements. We're looking at the commissioner's minutes to make certain that we're aware of anything that's significant that occurred during the year that we need to be aware of. We perform walkthroughs of your systems to make certain we have an understanding of the flow. And then we also assess how well we follow that. So if the procedures say we do 1, 2, and 3, we'll go back and test to see if we are in fact following the way the policies were written. We'll test internal controls and evaluate their effectiveness, and then we'll perform any other substantive tests that we feel are necessary, as well as prepare any confirmation requests to third parties. So it's a pretty lengthy process, and we're on site for about 3 days, and it's usually 3 people. And we keep the management team hopping, and then we leave. And they know that we're going to be coming back, and generally it's 2 to 3 months later after they have time to properly close the year end and reconcile all of the accounts. We returned the first week of October, which is consistent with what we've done in the past, and so we had a pretty quick turnaround because here we are on October 24th with the draft. So I will commend all of the staff for being fully prepared and responsive to all of our needs. It went very smoothly. We performed all of the tests of the financial statement accounts, and we looked at supporting documentation to support the account balances, and we proposed any audit adjustments that we saw. Then after we finish what we call our fieldwork procedures is when we start doing things like drafting the reports and the statements, preparing any other required communications that we typically share with you at that final meeting, and have an exit conference with management. And then lastly, we prepare the uniform financial report that gets submitted to the state. So that gives you an overview. And when we return for final field work, we're generally here about a week and a half, and that's 2 to 3 people on site every day, just to give you a little perspective. The next slide is just again to remind everyone of their individual responsibilities. Management is responsible for the financial statements, and our responsibility as auditors is to plan and perform the audit to obtain reasonable assurance that the financial statements are free of material misstatement and then express an opinion on the financial statements based on our audit. As I've mentioned in the past, the audit is performed in accordance with generally accepted auditing standards and as well as government auditing standards. We do expect the town to receive an unmodified opinion on the financial statements, and again, unmodified means unqualified, meaning a clean audit report. Now, this is where it always gets a little tricky, because it's only in the government arena where you actually see that an entity has to prepare two sets of financial statements. And I know I come here every year and I talk about the two sets of financial statements and I explain the process, but I recognize too that you only see it one time a year when I'm here. The town does not produce two sets of financial statements. They prepare one, and that's what you see throughout the course of the year. And it's only at year end that you see these two sets. So I wanted to make certain you just kind of understood the process and recognize that when Cole gives you financial information, it's always at the fund level. And when we come in at year end, we do a reconciliation from the fund level statements that he prepares to the government-wide financial statements. So you'll see that there's two sets, and we'll commonly refer to them as government-wide or fund level, and then we're going to go into a little more detail on each of those. And I apologize for the commissioners who've heard my spiel year after year. So under,
On my 18th year.
And I'm always learning, so I'm okay.
well, I feel like if you only hear it once a year too, if nothing else, it reinforces your knowledge. So that's what we're here to reinforce knowledge. So there are two government-wide financial statements. The first one is the statement of net position, and the second one is the statement of activities. So whenever you see those statement titles, that should signal to you that that's a government-wide financial statement. The purpose of the statement of net position is that it presents the financial condition of the governmental and business type activities of the town. And that's the buzzwords, governmental activities and business type activities. So when you look at the draft report that I know each of you have in front of you, and you look at that statement of net position, you'll see two columns. One's the governmental and one's the business type. And whenever we're referring to the business type, it's going to be your water and sewer activities. Everything else falls in the governmental bucket. So, accountants like to show things illustrated. So often we use all kinds of buzzwords, and when I kept talking about net position, you might be saying, what is it? So the net position is an equation. It's going to be taking your assets plus your deferred outflows minus your liabilities and your deferred inflows, and that's your net position. Okay, just, equation. This next slide gives you a quick snapshot of the total net position for the town at the end of fiscal year 2016, and you'll see that we're just under 33 million on a government-wide basis. And as I mentioned, since we break them into governmental activities and business type activities, you'll see 85% or 28.1 million is business type activities, and the remaining balance of just under 4.9 is for your governmental activities. And the very bottom of the slide, you'll see that that's a less than 1% decrease from fiscal year 2015, so it's fairly flat. The second required government-wide financial statement is something called a statement of activities, and that presents a comparison between your direct expenses and program revenues for each program or function of the town's governmental and business type activities. When you're looking at this statement, it looks a little odd, because most of the time when you're looking at revenues and expenses, you expect to see things like revenues at the top minus your expenses, and you're coming down to a subtotal that's either going to say net income or loss. When you're looking at the statement of activities, the format's very different, and they start in the far left column with total expenses. So in this slide here, we're illustrating your fiscal year 2016 results, where your governmental activity expenses were just under 1.8 million. The revenues that were generated alongside it show that we had charges for services of about $277,000, operating grants and contributions of about $126,000, a small amount of capital grants in the current year as it pertains to your governmental activities, because you'll see something a little different when you look at your business type activities. And then our general revenues are just under 1.4 million. And your general revenues include all the things, property taxes, local income taxes, they're probably the two biggest ones sitting in that bucket. When we look at our business type activities, and again, that comprises your water and sewer activities, our total expenses were just under 1.8 million. Our charges for services were over 1.4 million. Our capital grants were just over 316,000, and we had general revenues of about 9. So when you add that all up, you'll have a change in net position government-wide of a decrease of about 28,000. And when we break it down by governmental activities and business type activities, we'll see that the governmental activities had a positive number, which would be an increase in net assets of just over 6,000. And our business type activities had a decrease of about 35,000. Any questions, comments? So I mentioned earlier that we also have to do fund level financial statements. And so I think it's important, the next couple slides give some basic definitions and give you a little bit more information as to how government works, and then a little bit more specific as to how it pertains exactly to the town of Emmitsburg. So a governmental fund type, when you hear someone mentioning a governmental fund type, these are usually funds that are accounted for, that account for tax-supported activities, and there are generally 5 types. So if you looked at the accounting literature, there's typically 5 types of governmental funds. The town of Emmitsburg has 2. They have a general fund and a capital projects fund. Certainly you're not required to have all of them. Many only have a general fund. In your case, you've chosen to have 2. The general fund serves as the chief operating fund for the government, and it's used to account for all the financial resources not accounted for in some other fund. So everyone's going to have a general fund. You've chosen to have a capital projects fund in addition to the general fund, and that fund type is used to account for financial resources that are going to be used for acquisition, construction, or renovation of major capital facilities, generally spanning several fiscal years. And again, these are some general statements. So typically what you have is ongoing projects that we know will overlap fiscal years and typically are multi-funded. You're also going to hear terminology when we're talking about our business type activities, something called a proprietary fund. And when you hear the words proprietary funds, that usually means that the focus is on determining operating income, changes in net position, or a cost recovery type model, and requires a financial position and a cash flow. And there are 2 types of proprietary funds, the enterprise funds and internal service funds. The town of Emmitsburg has just enterprise funds, and that's because we have external users. And when we have an internal service fund, it's generally internal users. And some of the examples that you might see at a county might be a large motor pool for a fleet. It might be a print shop. So in your case, we don't have any internal service funds, but we certainly have external for enterprise funds. So next, this is just going to give you a quick snapshot of our governmental funds. Our total assets at the end of fiscal year 2016 were just over 2.2 million. We had liabilities of about 157,000, and our total deferred inflows of resources were about 120,000. So again, looking at the equation, assets minus liabilities minus the deferred inflows, we got a fund balance of just under 2 million. So this is the next slide, and I've got lots of definitions, and again, just a quick reference point as well. So when we're looking at fund balance that I just said was just under $2 million, there's 4 or 5 categories that we have to look at. So the next slide is going to give you some of the definitions. So you might see non-spendable, and that would be including amounts that cannot be spent because they're either not in spendable form or for legal reasons must be kept intact, and they've given you a couple examples here. You could have restricted fund balance where the constraints are placed by some externally imposed, which would typically be debt covenants or a grantor or a contributor. Committed, assigned, and unassigned. Now, you're going to probably typically see these more often. Committed means amounts that can only be used for specific purposes because of a formal action. So often there is a resolution or an ordinance, which would be the town's highest level of decision-making, that would commit fund balance. Assigned is something one step lower. It would demonstrate the town's intent for something to be used for a specific purpose, but did not meet the criteria to be restricted or committed. And the intent can be stipulated by the Board of Commissioners or any official, depending on how the form of government was set up.
Excuse me.
And then lastly, anything that didn't fall in the four previous categories falls into the bucket of unassigned, and that's just the residual balance. So when we look at the town of Emmitsburg and we look at our total fund balance of about $2 million, you'll see that we had non-spendable of about $10,000, and in our case, I think it was all prepaid items. We had restricted of about $206,000, assigned, which was just over $545,000, and then the remaining balance of 1.1 was unassigned. The next statement I just want to make a few highlights on is the statement of revenues, expenditures, and changes in fund balance. And again, this is including all of the governmental funds of the town, so it's including general fund and capital projects fund. We had revenues just shy of 1.8 million. Our expenditures were slightly under that, just a little over 1.7, and our excess of revenues over expenditures was a positive 56,000. I'm going to pause for a moment. So we talk fund level, we talked government-wide, and so this slide was intended to illustrate to you the types of reconciling items that you'll generally see. So when a town issues debt on the governmental funds, it becomes an other financing source. On the governmental activities, it becomes a liability. Okay, a debt obligation is a liability. When we're looking at the payment of principal on debt, and we're looking at a governmental fund, it becomes an expenditure, and that expenditure will be called debt service payment. When we're looking at it from a governmental activities perspective, we see that principal payment as a reduction of a liability, similar to a business. When we're outlaying for capital items, such as acquiring assets or constructing assets on the governmental funds, it's going to be an expenditure. It will show up as a capital outlay expenditure. However, when we're preparing the governmental activities, that becomes an asset that will be capitalized and depreciated over its estimated useful life. Depreciation is not reported on our governmental funds. However, it's reported as an operating expense on the government-wide. Last item, and again, these are some of the more significant ones. Pension-related items is not reported on the governmental funds, but it is reported that an NPL means net pension liability, is reported as a long-term obligation, and there's deferred items associated with the pension on the statement of net position. So that might be a quick check sometimes when you're looking at something, or if someone is thinking, why isn't depreciation showing up on my fund level statements? It's a reminder, it's not supposed to be there, it's only on my government-wide. So this next slide illustrates how we got from an excess of revenues over expenses of $56,000 when we looked at fund level financial statements to the change in net position of just over $6,000 when I first started the presentation. So you'll see the adjustments for fiscal year 2016. We had debt service expenditures, which would be our principal payments, of about $34,000. We had depreciation expense of just over $189,000. We had capital outlay expenditures of about $144,000. Our change in our compensated absences was 15,000, and then our net pension adjustment for the current period was a decrease of about 54,000. So the purpose of the reconciliation is to say, how did I get from my fund level statements to my government-wide, and these are my reconciling items. This next one, which might be a little harder to read because there's a lot more data on it, does the same thing when we're talking about fund balance, when we said our fund balance was just under 2 million. However, when I showed the net position for governmental activities, and it was clearly much more at, and I can't see if that's I think it's 4.8. Yeah. All right, see, I said it's kind of small. All right, let me. Okay, thanks. Yeah, I can't see that one much better. Okay, so when you look at this reconciliation, it's taking your property equipment, which we mentioned only shows up on your government-wide financial statements of just over 3.5 million. Our deferred outflows related to the pension of about 71,000. Our deferred inflows of resources, which was a decrease of about 28,000, and then a number of long-term liabilities that are not reported at the fund level, but are required to be reported government-wide. And you'll see our long-term debt was just over 300,000. Our compensated balances were 108,000, and our net pension liability for governmental activities was just over 346,000. So again, the purpose here is to illustrate the differences between fund level and government-wide. Earlier, I introduced the term enterprise funds, and again, it was used to report an activity for which a fee is charged to external users to provide goods or services. And I mentioned the town does have two. We have a water fund and a sewer fund, and they are both separate. This next slide gives you a quick snapshot of the water fund, and you'll see we have some comparisons to 2015. Our operating revenues from 15 to 16 did show a decrease from 563,000 to about 503,000, and that was about an 11% decrease. Our operating expenses showed about a 3% increase, going from 554,000 to about 571,000. And again, the difference between my operating revenues and my operating expenses is operating income or loss. So in fiscal year 2015, we had operating income of just over 9,000, and for the current period, we actually had an operating loss of about 67,000. The same thing for the sewer. This shows how our revenues and expenses compare year over year. There was about an 8% decrease in our sewer revenues. At the end of fiscal year 2016, we were about 926,000. You'll see a huge increase in our operating expenses as it pertains to the sewer fund, and that's attributed to a number of things. The first, with putting the wastewater treatment plant online in fiscal year 2016, our depreciation expense went up significantly, well over $150,000 more than the prior year. Also, we had interest expense of about 100, and I'm going to say it was about 150. That in the prior year, we were able to capitalize any interest because the project was under construction, and you're able to capitalize the interest during the period of construction. Once the construction was complete, it now became an operating expense. And then the third line item seemed to be that we just had an increase in our operating supplies as a result of a larger plant, and so you saw things like chemicals going up. So those three things seem to kind of hit why there was such a huge increase in our operating expenses for the sewer fund. So last year, when we looked at the sewer fund, we had a operating income of about 326,000. This year, you see that we have an operating loss of about 100. The next thing I just want to highlight highlight for your benefit is, as I mentioned, since the audit is done in accordance with government auditing standards, we are required to look at the town's internal controls over financial reporting and compliance. And we're required to communicate in writing to you if there are any items that were deemed to be a material weakness in internal controls. And here we've provided what that definition is. And the key things would be looking at, again, a deficiency or combination of deficiencies in internal control such that there's a reasonable possibility that a material misstatement will not be prevented or detected and corrected on a timely basis. We did not identify anything that we believe to be a material weakness. We also did not identify any issues of noncompliance that are required to be communicated under government auditing standards. We're also required to look at internal controls over compliance, and again, as I mentioned, there were no issues of material noncompliance. This next slide, we just thought maybe, again, I threw a lot of numbers at you, and I'm thinking, well, what would be some of the financial highlights of things that you need to remember as you're thinking back over fiscal year 2016? So I think it's important for you all to know the following items. At the end of June 30, 2016, the town's proportionate share of the net pension liability, by being a participating government in the state's retirement plan, your proportionate share of the liability is just over $596,000. And that is spread across all of the funds. And so when we looked at some of the governmental activities and you saw it being a reconciling item, that was just accounting for the piece that pertained to the governmental activities. Each of the water and sewer funds are also carrying their share of that liability as well, since we have employees working in all the funds. We also wanted to highlight that the town had some additional borrowings in fiscal year 2016, and that was just about $73,000. At the end of June, the town's long-term debt obligations are just over $7.1 million. And of that, $535,000 will be due in the next 12 months, okay, also referred to as the current portion of the long-term debt. And then lastly, the wastewater treatment plant was capitalized and placed in service in fiscal year 2016, and the cost of that was approximately $17.7 million. Questions, comments?
Sure. Any questions so far? No? Okay. Mr. Sweeney? Okay, just going back over some things, I'm going to this form of the report, so this has page numbers on it, so just going over our relationship with Draper and McGinley. Liability coverage, I'm assuming there's liability insurance, so if there's something that's missed, that's a glaring error that we would hope that the accountant would pick up, liability coverage is there to protect the town for an exposure, is that correct?
I imagine, yes.
Okay, good,
yes.
okay, no, you know, I have to think in worst-case scenarios as you do, so I hope you understand that. Okay, I was very glad to hear the staff was very cooperative, that's very encouraging. Where are we? Oh, going to the funds, I'm trying to find my fund types here. Okay, yes, I'm going to page 8 on this sheet.
Okay.
Okay. We've got the general fund, and you have the capital fund, capital projects fund for us as well. Why, or is there any value to adding any of these other types of funds to how we account for our money use in town? I mean, we're a small institution. I'm on page 8 of this one, okay.
Fund types, yeah.
So my answer to that would be the Blue Book, which is a governmental guide that's out there, you've probably heard it referred to, often recommends that you have the minimum use. So they would
Okay.
not encourage you to have more funds for the sake of having more funds. We might have a small municipality that only has one fund.
Okay.
Way back in the day, it became important to you all and to probably most of the towns that I want to be able to see how well my water and sewer operations are doing, and I want to make certain that I am collecting enough fees. And so when it's all buried in the general fund, it becomes more difficult to see. So that was the reason why you decided many years ago we would like to establish 2 enterprise funds to track that type of activity. Special revenue funds typically would be something where maybe you got, and again, we're not seeing this as often as we used to see, maybe there was a large CDBG grant for businesses. and let's say they got $200,000 and they wanted to be able to track everything in there since it came from a specific funding source. So you tend to see that type of thing through a special revenue fund. I don't see much for debt service. I think probably you might see it more at the county level, where it's just so much more complex, where they might feel a need to have a debt service fund, and likewise with the permanent fund. So I think for a town your size, quite frankly, you have the appropriate funds.
Okay, great, thank you. It just seems like complexity adds cost.
Right.
That seems to be the Blue Book piece, but I want to make sure that we're not missing anything. Where were we? Okay, I'm looking at our balance sheet on page 10. So the top slide there. You referred to, here in the third line from the top, total deferred inflows of resources. What would be a deferred inflow?
So you gotta love accounting world, right? They weren't happy with assets, liabilities, and fund balance. They decided a year ago that they wanted to add the terminology deferred inflows and deferred outflows. So a deferred inflow would be something that you would receive in advance that would benefit a future period. And so more typically than not, that might be maybe a grant that you received in advance before you actually had spent it. I think in your case, Commissioner O'Donnell, you also had some property taxes that came in before the tax cycle. Again, we hadn't seen that in a while, but we've been seeing a little bit more of that in the last 2 years. So that was one of the deferred inflow items for you.
Great, okay, thank you. Where are we? Not saying that numbers scare me, but turning to the very last page, just trying to make sure I have a comprehensive understanding. You explain with great clarity the, I guess, three pieces to the costs of the sewer-related increase. But backing up to page 14, with the expenses related to the water funds, I'll just keep it simply labeled that. You said that we had a loss of approximately $67,000. Is there a means by which we can account for that, or is this a good time to ask that question? I realize
That's
we're in the
perfect.
kind of
That's perfect.
Okay.
So if I were to look at that, it really looked like what we saw was that there was a significant decrease in consumption, and as a result, your operating revenues were down. A 3% increase in expenses, there really wasn't any one particular thing that jumped out. You know, to me, that looked fairly normal. I think what you really saw was that there was just a significant decrease in your revenues.
Okay. All those bricks and toilets, you know, who knows? Okay, just a thought. All right, very good. So number one, I appreciate your input and your candor. Any other commissioners have a question? No? Okay, and I think one thing I should note, I neglected to note earlier, Commissioner Ritz is not attending this evening. He did state earlier that he would not be here, so this was known in advance. Beyond that, Mr. Mayor, any questions?
No, I think we're good to go. We got a lot of work to do and,
Great, okay, all right.
So just to keep everyone in the loop, so here's what has to happen now, okay? So the draft report's here. We'll be working with the management team this week to complete the draft. Kathy and Cole, along with the mayor, will be working on the management's discussion and analysis. Okay, that's what management provides. We as auditors need to review that, read it, make certain it's consistent with the results of our audit. And then once we're satisfied with the content of the MD&A, that'll get inserted. And if you're looking at your draft too, you'll see that there's a number of missing pages, and that's where the MD&A will be inserted.
Okay.
And then after management has accepted the draft and we've answered all of their questions, because they certainly may have some questions as they're looking at things over the next few days. Once everyone's satisfied that everything looks good, we'll finalize our report. We'll insert the date of completion to be the date that they've accepted the draft as presented, and then we'll get it signed, sealed, and delivered and uploaded to the state by Monday, the 31st.
Great, okay. Thank you very much. So, last call, questions? Hearing none? Okay. All right, in that case, thank you. We appreciate it. We're going to move forward to our second agenda item now, related to the EOT Lagoon proposal, discussion, and possible consideration. So, Mr. Mayor, do you want to roll that out, or?
I'm gonna let Kathy roll. Kathy did a terrific job working with our, the people here, proprietors who wish to put this system in and work with us, and, I'm gonna let her go. I wanna talk to Michelle 1 minute. You go ahead, Kathy. Yeah. Excuse me.
Okay. You're leaving too? Everybody's jumping ship now. Good evening. As you know, we did the presentation at the first meeting in October about the lagoon proposal, or the lagoon lease, which was the original proposal from Enviro Organic Technologies. Mr. Snyder made his presentation. You received the draft contract or lease proposal prior to that meeting. And then you saw our town attorney's concerns or comments related to the draft proposal, which was then sent back to EOT. And they made every change that was requested by the town attorney, made some adjustments to the insurance coverage as well. We've had many conversations back and forth with the mayor, myself, and Mr. Snyder about the terms of the contract. Our recommendation was to see a CPI increase over a period of time to account for inflation and adjustments, and they were agreeable to that as well. The only change that you'll see that's a change that you may want to consider is they had asked for a 7-year contract with 3 additional year extensions. Mayor and I discussed it and felt that 5 years was more reasonable with the additional 4-year, 1-year extensions. You can see the comments that came back from Mr. Clapp this afternoon, that he's reviewed everything, and the lease appears fine to him, with one small cross out. I did ask Mr. Snyder to be here in case you had any additional questions.
Okay, does anybody have any questions for staff before we turn to the Snyders, if there's a need to turn to the Snyders? No?
The one thing I will mention is the income, if this is approved, and as you can see by the audit, we need to keep that money at the sewer plant. The operating expenses have significantly increased, and they're going to continue to increase. That's all I have.
Okay. A question that I have, and I didn't see it earlier, and I meant to put, well, the notes I have aren't here, but the question I had related to what I'd posed in the last meeting related to spillage. If there's an on-site spillage, I'd asked that we'd been notified. Is that noted in this? Because I didn't see it when I went through it, but I'm not necessarily the best trained eyes on this, so.
That would be that we would be notified.
Correct.
I didn't see that in there either. That certainly can be added. They did add under the insurance, the pollution insurance that they carry for $2 million. That is in there, but we can certainly add that line that we are notified. Somehow that got missed.
Sure, okay. Well, that would be, I would ask that were there, but.
Okay.
Do you need a motion from the board related to that? I think you might.
Okay.
Okay, so, Mr. Sweeney, I'm going to hand this over to you. Okay. Before we do, though, time-wise, in the event that there is a spillage on site, like hose detached from cargo, from tanker truck or whatnot, from transporter, we'll say, 24 hours or sooner? You know what I mean?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay?
Immediately.
Immediate notification, pending, addressing the immediate emergency? would that be? Okay,
Yes.
so immediate notification, all right. So,
I need a motion to adjust the contract for
okay,
spillage? Is that what you're looking for?
yes.
Yes.
All right, so I'm trying to get my language together.
And would that go underneath the pollution one, or just add it on?
We would probably just add, somewhere under loss and damage or use of premises. We'll certainly get it in there where it's appropriate. You might as well come on
You
up,
may as well
because
come up.
they'll
Good
have
evening, hello,
questions.
yeah, that's, yeah, correct. Name and home address, and we'll go from there.
Phil Snyder, 2323 Marston Road, New Windsor, Maryland, Vice President of EOT. I would suggest that we put a contact name or a number in there also.
Great, okay. All right, so Ms. Willis, is there a number that you would identify? Like Mr. Click or Mr. Thistle, perhaps?
We
or-
would use the main number here, and if you receive the voicemail, it would have Mr. Fissels and Mr. Click's contact information on the voicemail.
Okay, so,
And they would in turn contact myself.
great, okay, so 301-600-6300. Okay. All right, so, I just want to work the language first to see if this seems reasonable to the board before I make a proposal. But my intent would be to make a motion to notify town office or staff immediately in the event of spillage, additionally requiring contact by Snyder or Associates, EOT, was that the proper name, the company?
Well, that's abbreviation.
Okay, so EOT or their agents, contact town office at 301-600-6300 and pursue until contact is made with staff. So they have a live body. Does that sound reasonable? Mr. Sweeney, does that seem, I mean,
Yes.
you may have run across this before in your experiences. Is that accurate?
This is only gonna be for spillage on our property?
Correct. Well, that's a good question.
Because it's only, they're responsible anyways, they'll carry, since you're carrier, we shouldn't have to be,
No, only on property, yeah.
and they're only gonna be on our property just a little piece.
Sure,
Right,
sure, great,
right.
great. And I'm
Yeah.
hopeful, no, I'm optimistic, but
Yeah.
I just feel we really do have to know in the event that this occurs.
That's fine.
So,
Yeah.
okay, therefore,
You could add that, notify town office immediately if spillage occurs on the leased property. And there's an exhibit attached to the lease, and then that would be just the town's property.
okay. Okay, so language check, here we go. Okay, so my proposal would be this, a motion to notify, a motion requiring EOT to notify town office or staff immediately in event of spillage by EOT or their agents or contractor through contacting town office by 301-606-6300. Sorry, 600-6300. Until they reach, what, live staff?
Within 24 hours,
Immediately, though.
immediately.
All right, does that seem reasonable to all folks?
Yeah.
Now,
How do you want the wording of the last part? Because,
okay,
I mean, if we call and leave a message to that number, does somebody call us back? Or, I mean, I have Dan's mobile number.
right, that's typically what it would, like, what Ms. Willis just said was, when you call the town main line, if no one's there, as part of the voicemail that you hear, you'll be provided the number of town staff.
Oh,
So
okay.
Mr. Fissel or
Which is
Mr. Click.
Dane's mobile number.
I mean,
Okay.
you have Mr. Fissel's mobile number. There's nothing that precludes you from calling him.
Right.
I just don't want his cell phone number in the contract itself.
Okay.
So if you want to call him and you don't reach him, then you can call our number and you'd get Mr. Click's cell phone number.
Okay.
Okay. I have a live town representative. I don't know if that's versus a deceased. Okay, so,
Scary.
yeah, right? Okay, so here we go. I make a motion to have EOT notify town office or staff immediately in event of spillage by EOT or their agents or contractors by contacting town office at 301-600-6300 until they reach a live town representative.
Is there a second on that motion?
I'll second the motion.
Thank you.
Motion's been made and seconded. Any more discussion on the issue? Anybody? Mr. Mayor? Everything okay? All in favor of the motion, please say aye.
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 Aye. Any nays? Motion carries 4-0, 1 absent.
Great, thank you, sir. Okay, very good. Okay, so we've modified the contract with the spillage piece. Are there any other modifications anybody on the board sees fit to consider, to have considered, rather?
Where's the
No?
MOU? Yeah,
Okay. Mr. Mayor, go ahead. I didn't hear you.
I'm sorry.
That was something else.
I
Oh,
was just asking him for something, I'm sorry, aside.
no,
from-
no problem. Okay.
Kathy, do you need a motion to keep the, or do you want to restrict these funds to stay at the sewer plant? Is
Yes,
that what you want to do?
yes.
So you need a motion to do that.
I'd like a motion to do that. We can revisit it after 1 year, but for the first year, I would like to restrict all funds to the wastewater treatment plant, the operations of the wastewater treatment plant.
That would include the solar operations out there, okay, right?
The electric, it would also cover the electric for the
town.
wastewater treatment plant.
And the town, any excesses there. Okay, go ahead.
Okay, so is there
Okay.
an according motion?
I make a motion to restrict, the appropriate, I guess, the $80,000
The-
first year payment of, EOT
EOT, yeah.
to be, restricted just for the use of the operation costs for the new sewer plant
And solar field?
And the solar.
and the
There
solar
you go.
field.
Yeah,
That might divide some of that money, just so you know.
we'll look
Okay,
at it the
right.
second year, okay.
Okay, the motion's been made by Commissioner Sweeney. Is there a second for the motion?
I'll second that motion.
Okay, the motion's been seconded by Commissioner Buckman. Is there any further discussion? Hearing none, all in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Anyone against? Nay. The motion carries 4-0, 1 commissioner absent. Very good. Okay, so now we have the contract in front of us in general. I don't think we need any further modifications, or do we
I
want to
don't
give?
see any.
Okay.
Yes.
We want to give consideration to the contract, or do you have any recommendation to bring this language back to Mr. Clapp with any modification?
No, because the restriction of the funding would not be a part of the contract, and I do not, I mean, the notification does not anything that he would need to review.
Okay,
I think he's reviewed it 3 times. I think
Okay.
we're,
I think if what I would like to do is tomorrow morning, I'll put together an email and send it over to Kathy and let her review it. And if it seems like all the verbiage is acceptable, then I'll send it over to my attorney and have the contract amended with that clause.
okay, so no vote tonight then, until we have that information back?
He has to get through his attorney first.
Right, so that's what we're, okay, so
Okay.
all commissioners on board with that? That we'll wait to hear back from the contractor? Is that all right? Okay, any other comments? Yes, Mr. Sweeney,
Is
your
it going to
questions?
be, do you need this to, is this has to be approved before our next December meeting?
November 7th would be our next meeting.
Or
Yeah,
November?
I mean, that's okay. I mean, we actually have some work to do down there once we get the contract signed to transfer the material that's in one lagoon to another lagoon.
Right.
So it's probably gonna be like the middle of November anyway till we're gonna be able to use it, so.
Okay, so this will also agree with what you need then, you're
Yeah,
okay?
so
All right.
I'll get this modified and I'll be back on the 7th.
Mr. Sweeney, any more questions?
that's it.
Okay. Any other questions or comments from the commissioners? Mr. Mayor, any thoughts?
No, we're good to go. Thank you.
Very good.
That's fine.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you
Appreciate
very
it.
much.
Okay, very good. Okay, very good. All right. Okay, so we now move to our third agenda item related to discussion and possible consideration of the memorandum of understanding for the Square project, also related to the sidewalks on Main Street. Excuse me.
Prior to last meeting, I believe everybody received the draft MOU from the state for the upcoming Maryland 140 from Creamery Road to Timber Mill Run, water line, or the new water line as well, sidewalk enhancements and traffic safety enhancements. The MOU was sent to Mr. Clapp for review, and Mr. Clapp had no comment. He said the way that it was written, he basically had no comment. He didn't have any concerns about the MOU. Ms. Sipperly and I reviewed the MOU on Friday for any comments that we may have had. And it looks like they've included all the betterments that we requested, the construction of the new water line, the brick sidewalk at the town square, installation of a clock, landscaping at the town square, and the SHA-approved roadway marking beyond the crosswalks, which would be your circle in the center of the square.
Do they have copies of this?
Yes.
You do?
Is it-
That's all you got?
This
No.
and
You
the
got it?
MOU itself.
okay.
Are you looking for something else, sir?
Oh, wait, sorry, you got it.
And
It's not in
That
the
would have been
packet.
handed out at last meeting. I didn't make additional
Oh,
copies
okay,
because nothing
okay, got it,
changed.
okay.
Is we take a quick recess and make some copies if you, so in
Would you
case you
like
want to go
that?
through the
We can do that.
MOU.
I think that would be appropriate. Sure.
Okay.
Okay, so why don't we do this? Let's take, Ms. Willets, 5 minutes. Will that be sufficient for your needs?
Sure.
Okay, so let's take a 5-minute recess, and we will return at the end of 5 minutes with the hopes of further documentation. Great, thank you.